Thank you for choosing CTN. And now, it's time with Herman and Sharron.
Dr. and Mrs. Ben Carson. Had I mentioned that name a year ago, you may not even know who I was talking about. Back in the 90s, the early 90s, I had the privilege of interviewing the doctor and his beautiful wife. This book, Gifted Hands, was the subject. And now he has become so well known that we're going to pull out of the archives the interview. The sound is not good, the video is marginal, but I hope you enjoy this interview, because it was an hour interview. We had to bring it down to a 30-minute interview, and I'm looking at a book that was actually recommended by Jesse Jackson, recommended by Barbara Walters, a fabulous book. You'll have to go to Amazon in order to find a copy. But I hope you enjoy this interview. Listen carefully. The sound is not that good, the video is not that good, but enjoy. God bless you.
Would you make welcome Ben Carson, medical doctor, and his wife, Candy. She's a sweet lady. Here she comes. So nice to have you.
Hi, Candy. Have a seat.
Excuse me for that pun, you know. Sweet lady. I mean, after all. Thank you for coming to our backyard.
Oh, my pleasure.
This story is absolutely fascinating. You had a full scholarship to Yale University, and then you went to University of Michigan Medical School.
Correct.
But in the meantime, the way all of this took place, now, I wish I could just make you folks out there just so interested in this, but I hope you'll stay with us. But your mom instilled in you and your brother that you could do anything you wanted to do.
Absolutely.
And that your mind was as sharp and as good as any mind. Color had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Absolutely.
And whatever people said to you should have no effect on what you accomplished.
That's correct.
You did such a super job writing this, baby.
Well, let me just tell you, let me put that into perspective for you, because after the divorce, we had to leave Detroit. We went to stay in Boston.
So she couldn't afford to keep the house, but yet she was smart enough to rent that thing.
Exactly.
I mean, she was an entrepreneur.
She absolutely was, and she went to stay with her older sister and husband in Boston at one of the tenements, and that was an exciting environment, actually. They were what we call water rats in Boston. Anyone who's ever lived in there knows about these creatures. They're as big as cats. They can move a garbage can by themselves. Roaches all over the place, gangs, broken glasses, murder.
Now, I might add that the house that you could not afford to live in was a nice area.
Relatively.
You said it was 1,000 square feet approximately.
Right.
But to you it looked manless, and to you it looked like a beautiful neighborhood.
I thought so at the time. I have been back there subsequently. But
isn't it amazing how things change?
Things change, no question about it. But at any rate, while we were living in this environment, my mother was working 2 and 3 jobs at a time trying to get back on her feet. And after a couple of years was able to move back to Detroit. And at that point, I was an exceedingly poor student. I had no competition for last spot in my class. Always the first person to sit down in a spelling bee. I was the butt of many jokes. Students would
They called you the dummy.
They called me the dummy. They would laugh. They would say, "Hey, Carson got one right on the exam." But it was only because he was trying to get it wrong. I mean, they had all kinds of things that they said about me. And I began to believe pretty soon that I was dumb. And
you would sit there with that stare on your face.
Absolutely.
Trying to absorb these blows.
Trying to act like they didn't bother me.
Yeah, but hearing what your mother's saying all the time.
You mean all this time she was still telling you that you could do anything, even though you weren't applying yourself?
Although she didn't realize the magnitude of the problem academically until the midterm report cards came out when I was in the 5th grade, at which time it became quite evident that I was failing every subject. And that, for her, was an emergency. And she went to the Lord and she said, "Lord, what can I do to help my sons realize that they have a mechanism and an opportunity whereby they can change their environment and make successes of their lives. She just didn't know where to turn to do this because she firmly believed in this country. She believed in the American dream. She believed that you can rise from any environment in this country if you have the determination to do so, if you use your God-given talent.
And yet, now think about this concept. Yet, here you are, for all intents and purposes, poor.
Very poor.
I mean, we're talking
welfare, ADC, everything.
And she's thinking this way.
Yes.
So, if your mind is clean and correct and has the right goals, no matter what the surroundings are, you can come out of that thing.
Absolutely.
And right attitude. She had a right attitude.
Right. Well, you look at Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery, found himself in the prison.
Yeah.
And yet he continued with his faith in God. This is my favorite story from the Bible, by the way. And where did he end up? As the prime minister of Egypt. That's what God can do.
And the key, he forgave.
Absolutely.
He did not harbor bitterness. I see so many people, white, black, whatever, that harbor bitterness.
Right.
And it's like you won't let it go.
Right. Well, to me, that's pettiness. Because, you know, when you start to focus on simple things like the color of people's skin, it means that you have a small mind. It means that you don't have perspective. And I think it's one of Satan's tools.
Also means you're an idiot.
It does mean you're an idiot.
That's just my term.
You know, my mother told me when I was a youngster, she said, if you walk into an auditorium full of racist, bigoted people, she said, you don't have a problem. She says, they have a problem.
You get it.
She says, because they're all worried about whether you're going to sit next to them, and you can go sit anywhere you want. And, you know, I always remembered that.
That's good.
And I decided, you know, that would be one of the things that would direct my life. If somebody else wants to have an ulcer or die of a stroke because I'm doing something, it's too bad. You know, I'll help them when they fall out. Yeah. But in the meantime, I'm going to use the talents that the Lord has given me for the betterment of mankind. But anyway.
Can you tell me how old you were when your mother first started telling you that you can do anything you want?
Well, I think the time when it really became an urgent situation for her was when I was in the 5th grade, when I was about 10 years old.
Yeah,
but had she told you this before, prior to this?
She would make mention of it, but it wasn't a consistent theme.
Okay, that's what I wanted.
Until she saw that report card.
Okay. All right.
And
you know, she had in her mind, as I'm reading this, and it's the only document that I have, that she saw you accomplishing what you have today and your brother. At that little boy standing in front of her, she saw the accomplishments that you have enjoyed today.
Absolutely.
Now, how in the world do you get that into our mind and be able to absorb that kind of thinking? This world would absolutely turn around.
Oh, no question
if
about
we
it.
could accomplish what your mom did with a 3rd grade education.
Because the difference between her and a lot of other young mothers who have children is that she did not have the victim's mentality. You know, the victim's mentality says, you know, why are all these things happening to me, and gee, I can't do anything about this, and everybody's so unfair, and the world's unfair. And that was not her mentality. Her mentality was, well, this is the situation. Now, what are we going to do about it? What can we do to change the situation? It's a matter of the mental attitude and what a person feels that they're capable of doing. She also, I must say, had a tremendous amount of faith in God.
Yeah.
She believed that through faith in God you could accomplish anything. She believed the stories in the Bible. And she read those to us.
But think about this now, and we all meet these individuals and say, God, if you really are up there and if you really care about me, take a look at these surroundings. Look across town and look how they live. Now, how come you love them more than me? Nowhere did she ever talk that way, did she?
No, she didn't think that way. She thought like I think today. I would never say that to God, because I recognize as a neurosurgeon that God has given each of us over 14 billion cells and connections up there. Our brains are the most sophisticated things in the universe. And he wouldn't have given us all that equipment just to hold our ears apart. He wanted us to do something with it. And if you stop for a moment and think about the kinds of things that the human brain is capable of doing without even thinking about it. For instance, you know, if I look over to a dark area of the room and then I look up to a bright area of the room, it doesn't take me any time to do that. You can do that in a split second. And yet, what does your brain have to do? Well, first of all, those images have to come in through your eye. They fall on your retina. There's a chemical reaction that occurs in the rods and the cones that's transferred to electrical energy, which goes across the optic nerve, the optic chiasm, to the optic tract, to the lateral geniculate nucleus, around Meyer's radiations, to the occipital lobes for processing. While that's going on, electrical impulses are coming to the brainstem through the medial longitudinal fasciculus to coordinate the actions of the abducens and the oculomotor and the trochlear nerves. And while that's going on, other impulses are coming from the aging or Westphal nucleus across the parasympathetic fibers to the short ciliary nerves to contract the pupils. It took a little while to explain that. And that's minor. That's minor.
Now, you wanted to become a missionary doctor.
That's correct.
And somewhere along the line, it kind of detoured into a psychiatrist, and that's from higher learning. Psychologists would be mad at me. But psychiatrist, and then it also kind of twisted into becoming a neurosurgeon.
Right. It was interesting, the transformation. When I was a youngster, I was inspired by mission stories in church. And they frequently featured missionary doctors. And at great personal sacrifices, people would go to foreign lands and they would try to do all they could, not only to heal a person physically, but also mentally and spiritually. And it seemed like the most noble thing a person could possibly do. And that's what I envisioned myself as doing. That is, until I was 13, at which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich.
I mean, I like guys who are honest.
Yes.
Love it.
And psychiatry seemed like the best way to do that, because you sit there and you listen to people's problems all day, and you get paid $100 an hour. And you say, hey, that sounds pretty good to me. And I started reading Psychology Today, and I was a psychology major in college, did advanced psych when I first went to medical school. But that's when I started meeting a lot of psychiatrists. Well, I don't think I need to say more.
We've had a few of them.
No, actually, some of my best friends are psychiatrists. But I recognized that my concept of psychiatry, which I had gleaned from television, was not correct. But I had become extremely interested in the brain. And therefore, I wanted to do something that dealt with the human brain. I recognized that God had given me a lot of eye-hand coordination.
And you found that out when you're working in a steel factory.
That's one of the places I found that
Running
out.
one of the big cranes.
One of the big cranes.
Laying that steel precisely into the position that
Exactly.
you're supposed to do. You discovered you got a talent.
Which required using both your eyes and both hands simultaneously to swing the crane and take advantage of physical forces going through very narrow channels. But at any rate, I said, neurosurgery, of course. And I never deviated from that path after that point.
Before we get too much further away, could you fill in a gap for me?
How did I go from the dumbest student in the class?
Yeah, right, right.
Well, in fact, like I said, my mother said, this is an emergency. And she went to the Lord in prayer. Mm-hmm. What shall I do? And she felt impressed to turn off the TV set. Because we would come home and we would look at television, all the time, or play. We didn't want to do much else. And she said, tell you what, we're going to watch 2 to 3 TV programs during the week. Pre-selected. Pre-selected programs. And with all your extra time, and there'll be plenty of that, I want you to go to the library and get 2 books out each week, read them, and submit to me a book report. Well, you can imagine the enthusiasm, or lack thereof, that ensued.
Now, what would have happened if you hadn't have done what she wanted you to do?
Well, see, my mother was a wise person. She knew just what it was that you wanted most or didn't want most. And that would be the thing that you would get or not get. And I think that's a very good thing for parents to pick up on. You've got to recognize that punishments have to be tailored to the child. I mean, there are some children, you can spank them until you're blue in the face, and it will make no difference.
Yes.
However, if you deprive them of some activity or something that they like, it makes a profound impression.
And if you tell them that you're going to deprive them of it for 2 weeks,
exactly,
make sure it's 2 weeks and not 1 week.
Right, you have to be consistent.
I just heard an interview last night, a convict that talked about his mother, the opposite of this.
Yeah.
And he was talking about, we did whatever we want. When my mother said she was going to ground us for 2 weeks, we would be back on the street in 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
And she'd never say another word about it. It's interesting that you say that.
And that clearly was not the case with my mother. Well, at any rate, the enthusiasm did come after a few weeks, because she didn't dictate what books we had to read. And I was kind of interested in animals, so I started reading animal stories. And I loved them. And then I started reading about plants and then rocks and minerals. And I became fascinated with rocks. We lived near railroad tracks where there were a lot of rocks, and I started a rock collection and became fantastically interested in that. And interestingly enough, one day, the science teacher was talking about volcanoes and volcanic activity, and he held up a black, glassy-looking rock, and he said, "Does anybody know what this is?" And, I didn't put my hand up, even though I had read about it, because I figured one of the smart kids in the class would answer the question. And I looked around, and none of the smart kids raised their hand. And I said, "What is this?" So I raised my hand. And he looked. And, of course, everybody thought I was going to come up with some kind of joke or something funny. And I said, "That's obsidian." And he said, "Oh, that's right, that is obsidian," trying to hide his shock. And then I went on to explain, volcanic eruptions and production of lava and supercooling of lava as it hit the water and the formation of obsidian. And he was just flabbergasted. And he stood up and he said, "Ben has provided us with a great lesson here today. These things are absolutely right." He was beside himself. But the other kids in the class,
taking the credit. Man, what a teacher I am.
The other kids in the class just couldn't believe it. "Is that Carson? What is going on? Is this the Twilight Zone?" But the most flabbergasted person was me, because I said, "Wait a minute, maybe I'm not so dumb after all." I said, "Look at all these people looking at me with admiration. The same ones who used to tease me about being a dummy. Maybe I'm not so dumb." And the reason I knew this is because I was reading those books. And I said, why can't I do the same thing in history and social studies and every other subject?
And you did it with music. You did it with
everything.
You became an expert in
everything.
Dozens of fields.
I couldn't get enough books to read. Everything I could get my hands on. And within a year and a half, I'd gone from the bottom of the class to the top of the class.
Straight A's. Now tell me about that was it a chemistry test?
Now that was in college.
Okay.
I was able to go on to Yale University.
And the reason you chose Yale, now I have it here, he loved the College Bowl, that one TV program.
Right, GE College Bowl.
And you could not figure out which school should I go to, and after watching the College Bowl, and you saw Yale blow, was it Harvard?
Well, actually, it wasn't quite that way. I had $10, so I could only apply to one school, because that was the application fee. And I decided that I would apply to the school that won the grand championships of College Bowl that year.
Okay.
Because that was my favorite program.
Yeah.
And Yale blew Harvard out in the grand
Right
championships.
out of the box.
Just blew them out of the water. So I said, I don't want to go to a school with a bunch of dummies. So I applied to Yale. And
Harvard, a bunch of dummies.
And fortunately, they accepted me with a scholarship.
Full scholarship.
And I went off thinking that I was perhaps the smartest person in the world. And it's not certainly in the top 5. But it didn't take long before I recognized that I was perhaps one of the dumbest people at the university.
Because they started talking about the scores on the SAT test.
Absolutely. And the kids had tremendous backgrounds from the best schools and the best families across this country. And, the reason that I had thought I was smart before is because the competition that I was up against was not very great. Well, anyway, I also had not learned how to study in depth because I was able to cram and always do well in high school, and I could do what I wanted up until the exam. But here in a high-powered Ivy League school, I couldn't do that anymore. And I was pre-med, and I found myself the day before the final exam in the first semester failing freshman chemistry. Not even the slightest possibility of passing.
And once you fail that,
then you can kiss a pre-medical career goodbye.
so now your goal has to be put to the side.
Well, I said to the Lord, I always thought you wanted me to be a doctor. And I said, and yet it looks like I'm going to fail chemistry. And I said, Lord, would you please indicate to me what it is you really want me to do? I said, or alternatively, and preferably, work out a miracle. Well,
But here's the key, though. You started cracking the books.
Well, I did. I took my chemistry textbook and I flipped through it for a few hours and I memorized some pertinent formulas, but there was no way I could go through that whole thing. It was a very thick book. And I fell asleep and I started dreaming. And I dreamed I was in a large auditorium, just me, and there was a nebulous figure working out chemistry problems on the blackboard. And I was there taking notes. And when I awakened, that dream was so vivid in my mind, I went and I started jotting down some of the things that I had dreamed about. And I looked them up in my textbook to kind of confirm them. And when I went to that examination that day, with great trepidation, I took the test booklet and I opened it up and looked at the first problem, and I could hear the Twilight Zone music because I recognized that problem as one of the ones I dreamed about. Piece of cake. Next page, same thing. Right through the exam, piece of cake. And I tried to go very fast so that I wouldn't forget any of the stuff I had dreamed about. And I felt so confident after that examination. And fortunately, they had a policy whereby if you did extremely well in the final, even if you were doing failing work up until that time, they would throw out your classwork. And therefore, I was able to do extremely well in chemistry. And that was a very, very important experience for me, just like the bathroom experience with the knife, because that confirmed for me that the Lord had something He wanted me to do in the field of medicine, or He would never have done a thing like that. And I promised Him that He would never have to do that for me again, that I would become an in-depth learner, and that I would know my material so well that it would be impossible for anybody to intimidate me.
Tell me about that famous operation of the Siamese twins.
Well, Siamese twins have always fascinated mankind. They're extraordinarily rare. And the Bender Siamese twins were what we call occipital craniopagus Siamese twins. They were joined at the back of the head, where there's a tremendous blood supply, something we call the torcula, the confluence of the vascular sinuses. And no attempt at separating twins that had been joined in such a way had ever been successful before. They had all either died or become stroked out. Well, interestingly enough, before I heard anything about the Bender Siamese twins, a couple of months before that, I became enormously fascinated with the whole concept of craniopagus Siamese twins, and I started reading about them and trying to figure out why there was such a tremendous amount of morbidity and mortality associated with separating them. And I concluded that it was exsanguination, or bleeding to death, which was the primary problem. And I said, in this day and age, we must have some mechanism whereby we can get around that. I also did a lot of complex craniofacial surgery. And I said, there's a way that we can combine these techniques for complex craniofacial surgery and vascular surgery with the techniques the cardiovascular surgeons use when they operate on infant hearts. Basically, they use a technique called hypothermic arrest, where they cool the body temperature until the heart stops, pump all the blood out, and then they can operate on that heart for up to an hour before they restore the circulation without any significant brain damage or damage to other major organ systems. And I said, suppose we use that when we got to the critical part of the separation of these major vessels, and we could separate everything up until that point, then use hypothermic arrest, get through those vessels and reconstruct them, and then reestablish the flow. And then I kind of put that all on the back burner, recognizing that I would never see a set of craniopega Siamese twins anyway, because they're so rare. Lo and behold, 6 or 8 weeks later, there was the German doctor with the case, presenting it at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and I was called to give my opinion, and I looked at it, and I said, I think we can do this. And I started explaining this, and everybody said, that sounds like it might work. And everybody got excited, and we started putting the team together, and the rest was history.
It says, in fact, these are your words, looking down upon a human brain, working to help heal, I was hooked. You were hooked to become a neurosurgeon.
Absolutely, no question about it.
It's the 7-month-old twins joined at the back of the head. 22 hours of surgery?
22 hours, because even the induction of anesthesia in Siamese twins is very tricky, because if they're not exactly level, you can have materials that will pool and will cause changes in the cardiovascular status.
So you ran out of blood, didn't you?
At one point we ran out of blood. Things were going along reasonably well, and then when we were trying to isolate the sinus connection, we discovered that it was much more extensive than we had anticipated.
I'm trying to move this along because we got about a minute, but was it true some of the people helping on the operation gave their blood?
Well, they offered their blood because we ran out of blood, but of course their blood hadn't been typed.
Sure.
Well, it turned out that just as we were about to panic and give up, the Red Cross in the city came up with 10 extra units of specific blood, and that was exactly what we needed, 10 more units. And I think all those prayers were playing a big role.
Operation was a success.
Absolutely.
Did you deliver a baby at one time?
Yeah, our second child. It was not planned that way.
Yes, I know.
But it was very, very precipitous. And
how did you handle that, Mr. Surgeon?
Well, I mean, it decided it wanted to come out, and I just sort of caught,
You just were the catcher?
I was just playing catcher at the time.
That's actually his namesake, too. That's
Isn't that great?
namesake.
Right.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having
Ben
me.
and Candy.
Appreciate
What a
it.
privilege.
Thank you.
Dr. Ben Carson, candidate for President of the United States of America. Even though the video was marginal and the sound was not that good, I hope you were able to hear and to get a flavor of the core of this man and his belief system. I want you to pray for Dr. Ben Carson and all the candidates. God bless you for watching. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching It's Time. If you have recently made a decision for Christ, Herman and Sharron would like to hear from you.